Hi guys, this is Mr. Tan, and today we're looking at international business and globalization. A very interesting topic area which I'm sure that you're going to enjoy. So, let's before we start, let's go straight into the learning outcomes in terms of what we need to achieve. And they consist of three, which includes to appraise the importance and impact of global trade and globalization, to critically analyze the relevance of concepts, analytical tools, and theories associated with international business. And then LO3, which includes to critically evaluate the range of international business strategies undertaken by international businesses. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail now at this stage in terms of learning outcomes, but I am just going to point out one thing, and that is you need to read and understand the question first. You have got to break down the question and understand what the question is looking for. Because, for example, you can't just state what the importance is of globalization, because that's not the question. The question says to appraise the importance and impact of global trading and globalization, to appraise. So when you're looking at the questions, it's extremely important to first identify the key words. And when you're actually answering these questions, then you need to make sure not only do you answer the question, but you answer the key words. So the key word here is to appraise the importance. So, to appraise the importance of the impact of global trade and globalization. If we look at LO2, well, the key words here are what? Well, the key words are to critically analyze. Well, let's look at these two words. Well, what does that mean? Well, what does analyze mean? Well, analyze means to state how one thing affects another. So if we look at COVID and we say, well, how has COVID affected people in the workplace? Well, COVID in the first lockdown affected people predominantly from working from home. But then we also have to look at the word critically analyze. Critically analyze. Well, what's your opinion? What's been good and bad about this in terms of the factors that one thing affects another? So you have to make sure that you answer the question. Then the question goes on to say the relevance of concepts, analytical tools, and theory. So then you need to make sure that in this question you look at concepts, analytical tools, and theories associated with international business. And even if we look at LO3, we've got critically evaluate. Well, the key words here are to critically evaluate. What does that mean? What does evaluate mean? Well, in the English dictionary, evaluate means to weigh up. Therefore, to look for the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages. And then the word before that, critically evaluate. Well, here we're gonna, you're gonna debate it. You're gonna give us your critical opinion. So, you have to make sure that you really understand the question. So in class we're going to break down the questions and we're going to look at the keywords, and then look at exactly all the different elements that the question is looking for to make sure that you answer it. Otherwise, when we grade you in terms of knowledge and understanding, have you met the learning outcome? If you miss out key things in terms of the key words, then you wouldn't have met the learning outcomes. So identification of the key words and the different elements within the question is extremely important. The first assignment 1, will be a group presentation, 750 words plus or minus 10%. Due dates to be confirmed. You're going to have to produce this in a PowerPoint presentation. So again, the PowerPoint presentation needs to be referenced in text and referenced. It's a 20-minute presentation. Your choice of your organization should be agreed with your tutor during tutorials. And in the presentation report, you should cover all the learning outcomes 1, 2, and 3 as shown before in the previous slide. So that's enough about the assignment and learning outcomes. Let's move on to international business and globalization. So, before we can go on and we can look at assessing the importance of international business and globalization. So international business these are commercial transactions that crosses the borders of two or more nations. Imports, these are goods and services purchased abroad and brought into a country, and exports, goods and services sold abroad and sent out of the country. I mean, I can remember, before the internet came in, before technology came in, before emails came in, before WhatsApp came in, and Facebook and Twitter and so on and so forth, which came in after 2000. There were limited goods and services being employed in different countries. I mean, you wouldn't see half the range of products that you go and see now that you probably take for granted in the supermarkets. Look at all the product range that you have in the supermarkets that you see as standard. You think it's normal, but back in the 1990s, these goods and services were not available. You couldn't get an avocado in Tesco's or Lidl. There wasn't a Lidl, there wasn't an Aldi in the UK in the 1990s. So you only had the main retailers there. And you didn't have the full range of goods and services that you see now. Olives, you go into the supermarkets now, you can buy pat choy. Pat choy is a Chinese vegetable that you normally could only get in specialist Chinese stores. Now, all major retailers are selling them. Bean sprouts, Chinese ingredients. But we will look into all these things later as we go along. But I think imports are very important. Exports are very important. But again, if we go back to the definition in terms of what we're talking about, then we're talking about the removal of barriers to gain a more integrated world economy for the free flow of all these goods and services. But then you need all the other things involved as well, like banking, like technology, supporting services to help the transportation of these goods and services. So again, imports and exports we probably take for granted. But when we appraise the importance as well, you can think of it from two perspectives. You can think about the importance of an integrated world economy in terms of the removal of barriers. You can think of it from a country perspective in terms of developing countries, and you can think of it from a company perspective. So from a company and from a country perspective, the benefits to the country in terms of more jobs, in terms of more businesses, in terms of more corporation tax, in terms of more employee national insurance, pension schemes, and national insurance contributions and so on and so forth, that bring in more revenue to that country because more businesses are either exporting or importing goods and services. So, and even from the company perspective, what does it mean? Key players in international business, large companies from the wealthiest nations, firms from emerging markets, small and medium-sized companies, multinational corporations and born global firms. When we think about firms, we can classify them as either you could classify them as micro, small, medium, and large. And in the UK we can classify micro in terms of the number of employees or turnover. So if we look at the number of employees, micro from a company employing from 0 to 9 employees, a small organization that employs 10 to 49 employees, a medium organization that employs 50 to 249 employees, and a large organization that employs 250 or more employees in their company. You can also have this based and split by company turnover. But predominantly, when you look at companies, you don't really look at micro. You look at small, medium, and large organizations. So 0 to 49, 50 to 249, and 250 plus for small, medium, and large type organizations. When we look at this figure here, we can see, comparing the world's largest companies with select countries. So, some of the largest companies are from, we can see from Sweden, the USA, Nigeria, Belgium, Thailand, and then we come down to like Norway, Australia, United Emirates, and so on and so forth. So you can see the list of large companies by country. So, what do we mean by the globalization of markets historically? Historically, we talked about the American market and the German market because the American market and the German market were two big markets that most countries wanted to, tap into to gain revenue from. But tapping into those marketplaces, could be difficult if you are outside those marketplaces to compete within, because there might be tariff barriers, increasing your product's costs when trying to enter that marketplace. So, but now we're not really talking about the German market or the American market. We're really talking about the global market. We're talking about the world. The world marketplace is, where your opportunities lie. It's not just the German market. It's not just the American market. And, you have to ask why that is. Falling trade barriers make it easy to sell globally. Consumers' tastes and preferences are converging on some global norm. Firms promote the trend by offering the same basic products worldwide. And I want to go back to this point of consumers' tastes and preferences are converging on some global norm. Again, I think a lot of young people take for granted travel and worldwide travel and seeing destinations around the world. Before 2000, it was a lot more difficult. You didn't have EasyJet. You didn't have the low-cost aircraft carriers. Well, why is that important? Because not as many people were traveling around the world. Not as many young people were traveling around the world. Now, you can catch a one-way flight for £80 to another country on a low-cost airline. And a lot of people are now traveling more because it's cheaper. It's easier now. You've got the internet. You didn't have the internet back then. The process was completely different than the process is here now in terms of the way it's executed with the use of technology. You didn't have mobile phones back then. So, this has allowed people to travel more. Well, what does that mean? Well, because people are traveling more, people are experiencing different things. People are experiencing different countries. They are experiencing different cultures, and people's tastes are changing. They're experiencing different foods, and because they're seeing different things, different places, different styles, different cultures, different tastes, that has an effect on you. And so your tastes begin to change, and over a period of time you see that in people's homes in terms of the products that they're buying. You see that in terms of the foods that people are buying. You see that in the supermarkets that are offering these to meet the needs of their target customers who actually now have a direct need for this, whereas you saw these kind of like specialist foods before only in specialist shops on the high street, but now they're mainstream. So again, why is the global market happening? Ideally because of trade barriers, but I also think a large part because people are traveling more and people's preferences and people's needs are changing. So what is the globalization of markets? Firms of all sizes benefit and contribute to the globalization of markets. 97% of all US exporters have less than 500 employees. 98% of all small and medium-sized German companies participate, in international markets. 98% of all small to medium size. That's, small to medium sized companies that, that operate and export internationally. In the UK, 98% of all businesses are small to medium, whereas only 2% of businesses in the UK are large. But the 2% of the businesses in the UK, because they have multinational, they have hundreds of outlets or thousands of outlets, they represent almost just below half the the amount of turnover in terms of sales and taxes in comparison to small and medium-sized companies. So it's a huge number of small and medium-sized German companies, that participate in international markets, that sell in international markets. Globalization of production. What is globalization of production? Why is globalization of production important? Firms source goods and services from locations around the globe to capitalize on national differences in the cost of quality, of factors of production, land, labor, energy, and capital. Companies can lower their overall cost structure and improve the quality or functionality of their product offering. Well, what examples can you tell me? What does this mean? Well, let's just take Apple for example. How much is the latest Apple iPhone? How much do you think? Well, it's over £1,000. So my next question to you is, where does Apple manufacture their iPhones? Well, it's in China. So my next question to you would be, how much do you think it costs to manufacture the latest iPhone? Well, it costs no more than £15 to £20 to manufacture an iPhone. Hence the reason why Apple can brand it, Apple can market it. They can open up their direct retail stores as well as having intermediate retail stores that sell for them, and they can charge a lot of money for it, and they can make maximum profit. They are turning over billions in terms of profits simply because they are manufacturing their iPhones in China with the lower labor costs, because the people working in China charge a lot less, have to be paid a lot less than working in America or working in the UK or working elsewhere. Land costs are cheaper, energy costs are cheaper, and capital costs in China are cheaper. So all this helps Apple to maximize their profit. If we think about marketing can be defined as a mutually satisfying exchange at a profit in the long term. So you give the customer something that they want, and in return you get your profit. So in order to maximize your profit, you have to look at land, labor, energy, and capital. So the factors of globalization we can see are extremely important. If we think about Dyson, Dyson was all in favor of Brexit, and he was all for Brexit. And that's fine, but then as soon as Brexit happened, he up and left the UK. Why? Because he wanted to reduce his manufacturing and production costs so that he can maximize the profits for the Dyson product range. Again, setting up in another country with lower overall costs to maximize your profits. But you not only want to maximize your profits because you want to have maximum profit, but you want to maximize profit so you can use those profits to be reinvested back into the business, to go into marketing, meeting the customer's needs, into research and development, into new product design, and to ensure that you can compete on a national stage with other companies. Because if you don't compete on a national stage, then other companies are going to soon be doing what you're doing, and they're going to be doing it better than you. So you need to make sure that you make maximum capital. Because I know you've done marketing before, so a mutually satisfying exchange at a profit in the long term. You want to be there in the long term. You don't just want to be in business for 5 years or 10 years, 15 years. You want to be in business for 50, 100, 200 years. And you want to still be in business. And even if you've been in business for over 150 years, it doesn't mean you're going to continue being in business. If you look at Thomas Cook, he made so many mistakes, had billions of pounds in cash, and still went into liquidation. So again, there is no guarantee of being in business forever. Why do we need global institutions? So we've got international business, reducing barriers, and why do we need global institutions? Well, we do we do need global institutions, and they help to regulate and to police global marketplaces, promote the establishment of multinational treaties to govern the global business system. This is very, very important. Very important. Some examples of these institutions includes GATT, General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, WTO, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, UN, United Nations, and the G20. So we're going to go into a little bit more details in these. But I can tell you that these are all necessary in terms of trading, reducing barriers with different organizations within, for instance, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, where people compete in or are of a member of the WTO, then compete on the same basis. So you have a competition without barriers imposed within different companies in those countries that they're operating in. And even like the general agreements on tariffs and trade, World Trade Organization as well, in terms of contract law, in terms of law, in terms of arbitration agreements, and agreements and contractual law from an international perspective from different countries, because you can't always rely on your own country's legal system to base any disputes that might happen between companies, because importing and exporting is going to mean that you are entering into contractual obligations, not offer, acceptance, consideration, capacity, legality, and intent to create legal relations, so contract, depending upon which country you're in and what legal system do you apply to, and if there are any disputes, how do you reconcile those disputes. So having these global institutions are very important. So if we look at the World Trade Organization, like its predecessor GATT, policies the world trading system, make sure that nation states adhere to the rules laid down in trade treaties, promotes lower barriers to trade and investment. And so far, the WTO has, as listed in 2013, 159 members. And, they have, so if you're a member of for example, the WTO, and you are trading with a specific company and you're setting prices for that company in a WTO, then if another company wants to buy from you and they are also part of the WTO, then you can't sell them at a different price. You have to, the prices would have to be the same. You can't include trade barriers to increase your prices. So the prices or the barriers would be the same between different countries, between different organizations in the WTO. So this is why it's very, very important in terms of different countries in the WTO and companies operating in that system. If we look at the International Monetary Fund, which was started in 1944, maintains order in the international monetary system, lender, of last resort to countries in crisis. Argentina, Indonesia, Mexico, Russia, South Korea, Thailand, Turkey, Ireland, and Greece. International Monetary Fund. And even if we think about Greece, you might say, well, what's the point in terms of Greece? The point in terms of Greece was that Greece owed a lot of money to Italy, and if they defaulted and Greece defaulted and came out of the EU, then their defaults would impact Italy, which Italy was on a knife edge in terms of deciding whether or not they should stay in the EU or not. And then the money that the countries owed them, if Italy defaulted, would have an impact on countries like Germany and France, who had lent a lot of money to Italy, and Italy had lent a lot of money to Greece. So when you're looking at it, you might say, oh, Greece, well, what's the importance of helping out Greece and the EU or the International Monetary Fund? Well, it's very, very important, because one factor, and we analyze, the word analyze, key factor, if we analyze one factor, that affects another. So the effect of Greece, for instance, coming out of the EU could affect Italy, and Italy could affect France and Germany, and France and Germany could affect the UK in terms of the UK lending huge funds to Germany and France. The World Bank, 1944, promotes economic development via low interest loans for infrastructure projects. And again, when you look at the balance sheet and you look at the profit and loss account, Okay, in the profit and loss account, you have your gross profit and your net profit. And then you obviously have your minus your depreciation, interest charges, corporation tax, take away your um, any dividends to shareholders, and then you have your retained earnings. Those retained earnings goes into the equity of the side of the balance sheet. And the question really is, so many companies could go into liquidation if they don't have enough cash flow to meet their short-term obligations. I'm sure you've done accounts before, and if you looked at your, your current ratio, do you have in 1 year enough cash flow in your current assets or your asset test to meet your short-term obligations? Because if you don't, potentially, if your creditors called in the money that you owe them, then they could potentially put you into liquidation. So low interest loans is very important for the cash flow and the future survival of the organization, because in plowing huge sums of money into infrastructure projects, which cost a lot of money, could potentially be quite risky for a company in terms of cash flow, in terms of the bad times that things happen. And even if we think about, COVID-19 over the last 2 years, and we think about maybe the new rides for Adventureland or the Bear Grylls Adventure Park. Well, they would have had to build all these infrastructure, for example, and into their building up the Bear Grylls Adventure Park in Birmingham, and it would have cost a lot of money in terms of infrastructure. But even if we think about other infrastructure, then all these things cost a lot of money. So having low interest loans to pay for this over a long period of time is very useful in terms of the cash flow of the organization, especially in difficult times like COVID, when all the customers might drop off in tourism, hospitality, or so on and so forth. So you need to have cash in the bank to weather the storms at different times, because you never know what's going to happen. So cash flow is extremely important. You think about the United Nations, started in 1945, maintains international peace and security, develops friendly relations among nations, cooperates in solving international problems, and in promoting respect for human rights, in the sense of harmonizing the actions of nations. Very important, promoting respect, human rights, minimum wages, so these things are very important. G20 forum through which major nations try to launch a coordinated policy to response to the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, which hit the whole world. Again, this was due to the deregulation of the financial services worldwide, where money was no longer being based on the gold standard of various countries, but money was just making money on money on money and different layers of it. And so again, how do you sort this out? Because of the financial crisis, and so many companies were going down, which would then possibly affect people panicking, and possibly countries going into a recession. So again, and that itself would affect every single country in the world, and it did for a long period of time. And now, which the EU have included a 0.1% tax on all financial transactions between shares, stocks, and debentures from companies and countries in the EU. And that fund is expected to raise approximately 500 million euros a year. And that fund is to be used as a kind of a backup, just in case there is another financial crisis in the future. So hopefully, if over a period of 10 years the EU can save up all these billions of euros to have in backup, just in case another financial crash happens, which is not a bad strategy at all. Because if they go on for 10, 20, 30 years saving up all this money, and they've got all this money in the bank just in case it happens again. So if it did ever happen again, and as we've seen, more direct after the financial crisis. There was more regulation in terms of the financial sector, especially seen in the UK, but worldwide as well. But now we are beginning to see more deregulation within the financial sector again. So, where are things going to end up when there is more deregulation? So, very important. So, what is driving globalization? You know, but there are other things to in terms of the drivers. So, so as well as technology, we're thinking about the liberalization of cross-border trade and resource movement, declining trade and investment barriers. So we can see from 1913, France 21%, Germany 20%, and now in 2010, France is 3.9% in terms of barriers. Germany 3.9%, Italy 3.9%, Japan 2.3%, Holland 3.9%, Sweden, Great Britain 3.9%, United States 3.2%. Average tariff rates on manufactured products as the percentage of value, you can see the barrier declining trade and barrier investment barriers declining, especially from France and Germany from 1913, and Great Britain in 1950s to an average of 3.9%, which is great. So, what does globalization mean for firms? Technological change in terms of lower transportation costs, low cost information processing communication, low cost global communication networks, and global communication networks and global media. When we're talking about low cost communication networks, helps to create electronic global marketplace. Low cost information processing. Firms can create, manage global dispersed production. And you need to know what's happening where, and you can do this with technology to help again reduce your overall costs. And also for global communication networks and global media, this again helps towards the worldwide culture and a global consumer product market. Again, the removal of barriers where people can see what everyone's having around the world, and maybe they want to have this. Now you got your computer screen. Well, you can buy these a little handheld projector that you can just project in your computer screen. You can link up to your keyboard and then project it onto the wall, so you don't have to carry such a huge thing. There's so much more technological developments around the world. Changing demographics of the global economy. Four trends are important: the changing world output and world trade picture, changing foreign direct investment picture, FDI, foreign direct investment picture, and the changing nature of the multinational enterprise, and the changing world order. So these things are changing demographics of the global economy. So how has the world output trade changed? In the 1960s, the US accounted for almost 40% of the world economic activity. By 2012, the US accounted for 23%. A similar trend occurred in other developed countries. And we look at this in contrast. The share of the world output accounted for by developing nations is rising, expected to account for more than 60% of the world economic activity by 2020. So we can see a declining US economy, and we can see the developing countries increasing, in a nutshell. So here we can see this here. So we can see that the United States in 1960s had 38.3% world output, but now, in terms of world output in 2012, it's 8.7%. And if we think about Germany, again, it has declined. But the biggest loser here is United States, even the UK, 5.3% as a percentage of world output. Has dropped by 50%. So we can see the amount that countries have dropped by. So two biggest losers here we can see are the United States and the United Kingdom. So again, which supports the view that developing countries have been declining and the emerging countries have been increasing, which is only going to increase further. In 1960s, US firms accounted for 2/3 of worldwide financial direct investment flows, FDIs. Today, the United States accounts for 1/5 of the worldwide FDI flows. Other developed countries have followed a similar pattern, and in contrast, the share of FDI accounted for by developing countries has risen. Developing countries are rising. Developing countries such as China has also become very popular destinations for financial direct investment. And here we can see these countries on a graph and how they've changed over time. So what is a multinational enterprise? MNE. A multinational enterprise, any business that has productive activities in 2 or more countries. Since the 1960s, the number of non-US multinationals has risen, and the number of mini multinationals has risen. I mean, it's actually a big thing to go into another country in terms of a multinational enterprise. And later on, in terms of one of the learning outcomes, we'll be looking at the different strategies in terms of going into international business, or from a international business, or from a global perspective. So we'll be looking at this, because to set up another production facility in another country, is and takes a lot of investment and derives a lot of risk, because you're not guaranteed for success. And if you do that and it doesn't work, what will happen? A multinational enterprise. We can even look at Tesco's. Tesco's, went into the US trying to compete with Walmart, but they couldn't compete with them. And they spent years over in the US, and eventually they had to pull out of the US because they couldn't compete, and they hadn't done their research properly, and the competition was too much, and they lost £2 billion because it didn't work. And they had invested in terms of production in the US. So just because you do it, it doesn't necessarily mean it is going to be a success. Changing world order. Many former communist nations in Europe and Asia are now committed to democratic policies and free market economies. You've seen that with Russia. It wasn't until the 31st of January 1990 that they had the first McDonald's in Russia, because Russia didn't want that trade with the West. But now it's all over the whole world. Creates new opportunities for international business. But there are signs of growing unrest and totalitarianism tendencies in some countries. China and Latin America are almost moving towards greater free market reforms. Between 1983 and 2010, FDI, financial direct investment in China, increased from less than $2 billion to $100 billion annually. But China, has many new strong companies that could threaten Western firms. I mean, the Chinese companies, are expanding, and when they see an opportunity, they aggressively try and take those opportunities, and they see a need, they go for it. Even if you think about gambling, it's illegal in China to gamble, but then they will have companies that will set up hotel chains and so on and so forth in other countries, to have their revenue from people who want to gamble, but not in China itself. How will the global economy in the 21st century look? The world is moving towards a more global economic system. But globalization is not inevitable. There are signs of a retreat from liberal, economic ideology in Russia. But yeah, even though they are retreating, but it's still, they need that trade, because that trade is bringing in a lot of resources. And even if you think about Russia and you think about the trade that they do in terms of exporting their gas, Europe needs the gas. we've seen all the problems with higher gas prices because there's not enough gas flow, and Russia has all these gas flows, and they are developing their pipelines to go all the way from Russia to Europe. So again, even though there will be some retreat, I can't exactly see this happening because it brings in a lot more revenue to Russia. Globalization brings risks. Yes, of course, it's going to bring risks. Financial crisis that swept through Southeast Asia in the late 1990s. Yes, recent financial crash in 2008, and there were other risks as well. You've got the pandemic, globalization in terms of hospitality, tourism, industry sector, and you've also got many companies have moved towards just in time. The manufacturing vertically integrating backwards into their manufacturing, into their designers, like Zara, for example. And now with transportation and transportation links and the cost increasing and supply of raw materials increasing and so on and so forth, this can affect operations within companies that implement certain technologies like JIT. So there is a risk in terms of that as well. I mean, I've even heard now business people talking about not JIT, but reverting back to warehouses and JIC in terms of just in case, storing and holding these stocks just in case. So again, even when Brexit was happening, all the companies in the UK didn't know if we were going to get a Brexit deal or not. So they were storing at huge cost loads of stock of all sorts of things and foods and wines and spirits and so on and so forth, just in case it worked out we didn't get a trade deal with Europe with Brexit. And they had warehouses and stocks and this and the pharmaceutical companies as well, because we didn't know what was happening. So people opted for just in case rather than just in time. Is an independent global economy a good thing? Again, there are pros and cons in terms of the good things and bad things about globalization. It depends upon where you sit. Supporters believe that increased trade and cross-border investment mean lower prices for goods and services. I can see that. Take Lidl, take Audi. In terms of the end consumer, we're paying lower prices. Greater economic growth, higher consumer income, more jobs. I'm not too sure about the higher consumer income. Definitely more jobs at the moment, but higher income. In terms of comparing the income to the rate of inflation, I'm not sure. Critics worry about the globalization will cause job losses, environmental degradation, and the cultural imperialism of global media and MNEs. But you can't stop cultural imperialism because you've got Facebook, Twitter. You've got all the social media platforms, and people know exactly what's happening around the world. So you can't stop it. You just cannot stop and have isolation in terms of what's happening from one country to another. And then you have anti-globalization protesters now regularly show up at most major meetings of global institutions. How does globalization affect job and income? Critics argue that falling barriers to trade are destroying manufacturing jobs in advanced countries, and supporters contend that the benefits of this trend outweigh the costs. So, falling trade barriers, are destroying manufacturing jobs in advanced countries. Again, Britain has adopted for Brexit to on the various principles in terms of gaining back control of their legislation, in terms of protecting various job sectors, and giving and so on and so forth. But that hasn't really worked, because we think about transportation. Well, they're relaxing the rules in terms of transportation to allow EU workers to come back and transport, because we don't have enough people in the UK who want to do the transportation jobs. We don't have enough people in social care. We don't have enough people in the NHS. And so now they're relaxing the rules in terms of Brexit, in terms of allowing more people to come back into the UK from Europe. Even when it came to picking the crops, a lot of European workers were not allowed to come back into the UK to pick those crops, and there wasn't enough people to actually pick the crops, to harvest, to give it to the retail store. So they had to lay their and waste. So you know so I'm not too sure, because I don't think that it's going to be destroying manufacturing jobs, and it depends on the government as well. The government can invest into schemes like in Germany in terms of manufacturing, in terms of car manufacturing. The engineers are seen as doctors in Germany, and they are well respected. So I can't see the manufacturing jobs in the car industry in Germany, for instance, with falling barriers, being eradicated, because they have a unique system in terms of Porter's diamond model, which we will be looking at later. So how does globalization affect labour policies and the environment? Well, critics argue that firms avoid the cost of adhering to labour and environmental regulations by moving production to countries where such regulations do not exist or are not enforced. I mean, you have to um, you have to obviously operate in the country to the rules and regulation and legislation of that country. I agree with that, but on the other side of the coin as well, there's no place to hide. So, for instance, companies like Marks and Spencers and Primark previously bought from they manufactured clothes from India, and they were buying it from companies that may not have had the best regulations in terms of looking at human rights, in terms of labour, in terms of minimum rates, in terms of health and safety. And when it was published everywhere, the negative publicity would hurt these companies more. So I think that there is no hiding place today in the world in terms of what is happening. And so because of all these things, to a degree, yes, but they still apply to their legislation, which they need to meet. But if you're doing something which is which people think is morally incorrect, then you will be found out, and that will affect your customers wanting to buy from you. And supporters claim that tougher environmental and labour standards are associated with economic progress. But again, this will spring in roundabouts, and there are arguments for and against globalization. So how does globalization affect national sovereignty? In today's global market, shifting economic power away from national governments towards, supranational organizations like the WTO and EU and the UN, critics argue that unelected bureaucrats have the power to impose policies on the democratically elected governments of national states. Yes, to a degree. Supporters claim that the power of these organizations is limited to what nation states agree to grant. The power of the organization lies in the ability to get countries to agree to follow certain actions. Yeah, I mean, well, nothing is going to be perfect. How is globalization affecting the world's poor? Is the gap between rich nations and poor nations getting wider? Critics believe that if globalization was beneficial, there should not be a divergence between the rich and poor nations. And this is an issue, and this is the problem with a lot of companies taking out the resources out of those countries, and their financial resources out of countries without playing more back into it. Supporters claim that the best way for the poor nations to improve the situation is to reduce barriers to trade and investment, implement economic policies based on free market economies, and receive debt forgiveness for debts incurred under totalitarian regimes. So when we look at this, there are going to be pros and cons, and it's how the organization is going to be operating in other countries and how ethical they're going to be behaving as well. Because if we look at these, we can say to ourselves, well, with avocados. So in the South American countries, there's lots of avocado farms, but the companies now operating there are operating in terms of their corporate social responsibility and making sure that they invest back into the people, so that the people are getting the jobs, the people are getting, and their children are getting health and education and benefits. And So there are some companies that if they act in accordance to the corporate social responsibility and ethical concerns, which I think is important now because, as I said before, there is no hiding, then I think that would be the best way forward for these companies. And if they don't act in this way, I believe they will be found out and they will lose credibility with their customers and their target customers, because people are more socially aware and socially concerned with what's happening around the world. So, how does the global marketplace affect managers? Managing an international business differs from managing a domestic business because countries are different. The range of problems confronted, in an international business is wider, and the problems are more complex than those in a domestic business. You know, firms have to find a way to work within the limits imposed by the government intervention in the international trade and investment system. International transactions involve converting money into different currencies. So yeah, there are going to be different challenges and different things that a manager would need to do in terms of an international role as opposed to a domestic role. And it's even more so than that. Even if we're thinking about marketing, it's more complex in terms of the managers' roles and different managers' roles. Do you adopt a customization approach? Do you adopt an a standardization approach? And what about your segmentation, targeting, positioning? What about who you're segmenting, who you're targeting, who you're positioning, how you're positioning it, how you're using your marketing mix? So obviously, when you're looking at new marketplaces and all the ways of conducting that international business is obviously going to be different, but it's going to be a learning curve, and as you learn, it will be a steep learning curve, and that learning curve will then plateau, and then you will know exactly what you need to do and how you need to do it. But on the other side of the coin, you need to do it. You need to do it because if you don't, then then other companies are going to come into your country and compete against you. So I think it's something that companies will learn, and then sort of a new way of doing business. So thank you for today from Mr. Tan in terms of looking at the first slide, week 1 of international and global business.